Pleasure to introduce our speaker this year, but in any venue in which things are done in chunks, there is always a commercial. So, first I'm going to thank our sponsors. We could not be here today without certain groups at the university anteing up, and it really was a little bit like a poker match when we were asking for money. First person to name the number was the one who had to pay. So we were very quiet but encouraging. So I'd like to say thank you very, very much to the Department of History and the Department of Geography, both led by Kevins, I would like to say, and they give money freely, which is great. Also, the Office of the Dean of the College of Sciences and Humanities and the Office of the Associate Vice President for Research. Together, they were levered into providing us with more funds, so yay to them too. And thank you, that was the word for our sponsors. Now let's talk about the project and for Colin. So I first met Colin in 2010 at a conference in Bologna, Italy. And at the time he was engaged in collecting manuscript data for his thesis. It's fabulous because it focuses on killing people. Homicide, always fun. Much more interesting than what I do. So naturally I was enthused and enthralled. He examines violence and homicide amongst elites in Italy from 1550 to 1700. But even before I had met him, I was warned that he was quite possibly the hardest working person at the University of Toronto. He had brought his own chair into the research center so that I assumed he never had to stand, and also because he intended to be there all the time. And apparently that freaked people out, but...
Significantly. I had a bad back.
Okay. Don't tell people that.
That's what the chair was about.
Now, his contribution to the Dutch Summer Project shows just how much work he has done, and really how extraordinary it is. I introduced him to some of my undergraduate students this morning, my social history class, and we had a few minutes before they were going to make presentations, and so I said, do you have any questions? And the hand shot up, but the consensus was, on the first question, how long did it take you to do this? And the laugh that Colin gave suggested that it was a lot longer than he was ever going to admit. So this is a lot of work, substantial work in terms of time, but also in terms of impact. So Colin has been the lead research assistant from the project's beginning in Florence in the summer of 2011. And to properly build the Decimus platform, which we'll be introduced to today, he attended the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and I hear there were rabbits frolicking across the lawn. It was supposedly fabulous. And he learned something too. In fact, he designed the original census database, which is enormous. And he worked out the georeferencing model with local programmers in Toronto, and he continues to supervise the other participants of the project. His hard work, both as a digital architect and as a historian, has resulted in an extraordinary opportunity to really understand the people of the past and how they lived in families, in neighborhoods, in streets, in professional communities. There's a lot here. This is a contribution that's extraordinarily valuable, both for researchers and for students of social history. There have been other studies of censuses, but they tend to be less accessible, let's put it like this. And all of you can go home this afternoon enthralled by census data and try this out. It's available for everyone and very easy to use. Now, luckily for us, we're going to learn a little bit more about it here, but also in a forthcoming volume. In March 2016, Routledge will publish a collection of essays based upon the Decimus project, and also on a smartphone app called Hidden Florence, which I downloaded yesterday.
Isn't it fun?
And got my 8-year-old to play with. It's pretty cool. And you don't need to be in Florence, also fun. But you will get to know a wool worker who is surprisingly British for living in Florence.
He's a BBC guy.
Ah, okay. Wow, impressive. It's entertaining, guys. You should try it out. Now, together with Nicholas Terpstra, also of the University of Toronto, Colin is the co-editor of this collection. It's entitled Mapping Space, Sense, and Movement in Florence, Historical GIS and the Early Modern City, and it's bound to really open the gates further to this city and the extraordinary things that we can do with GIS and with historical data. Please join me in welcoming Colin Rose to Ball State.
That was far too kind. Thank you all. Thanks in particular to Jen for that effusive and mostly untrue introduction. Thank you to Doug and to Angie for welcoming me and making me comfortable and making sure I have everything I need here. And welcome everyone to GIS Day. It's very nice to have the opportunity to come speak to you about the Detrima project. Is my power on? Yes, my power is on. So what I want to do today is I want to give you a little bit of background into the Detrima project and what sort of thinking went into its construction and its design. And then I also want to sort of show you some of the work that's come out of that so far. And then if I have time, I'm going to take you onto the interweb. I don't have web on my computer, so I won't do that. But there are two different Detrimas right now. One of them lives on my computer and one of them lives on the internet. And you're going to see what the one on my computer can do today, and then I hope that all of you will go home and play with the one that's on the internet. The website is there, and it's a more limited web portal right now, but it's going to expand with the release of the book in March as well. GIS as a technology emerged in the 60s, 70s as an environmental science platform for I think it's developed by Environment Canada, in fact. In the late 90s, historians sort of started returning to maps after the postmodern abandonment of geography. And as we returned to maps, we got tired of drawing them by hand, and the field of historical GIS was born. It's still relatively young and it's still relatively underdeveloped. Right now it's dominated by more modern scholars who have large-scale data sets that are easily spatializable and easily compatible with GIS systems. So for instance, Anne Kelly Knowles, who is probably the leading proponent of historical GIS in the field, has worked on 19th century American railways and GIS of the development of the railway system and the industry that went along with it. Conversely, on the more literary side, Ian Gregory in Lancastershire, or Bath now actually, has taken the poetry of Wordsworth and the other lake poet. You can tell I'm a historian. And he's actually made a GIS of the lake poetry to compare, because Wordsworth, that's the other one. Or did I say Wordsworth? Yes, but it's Wordsworth and Keats, and then to solve the mystery of why they aren't actually talking about the same lakes, the GIS showed that they were going to different lakes. So it's generally, historical GIS is developing. It's a little up in the air right now in terms of standardization, and it's being approached from different angles by different groups. One of the big ones up in Canada is called NICHE, Networking Canadian History and the Environment, and they hold annual conferences where they seek to standardize methodology and seek to standardize data standards. Generally, there are 3 stages to an HGIS project, to a historical GIS project, and I'm going to walk you through those stages of the Detrima. The first is probably the largest. This is the bulk of time on an HGIS project is going to be spent on your database development. For us, this meant the transcription and transformation of a 16th century census manuscript into a FileMaker Pro database. I use FileMaker because it's user-friendly, and I'm a historian again. The second phase, which follows up on the development of the database and the initial cartography, is sort of the experimentation with your home data set to see what sort of maps you can create, what sort of questions are immediately prompted, and I refer to these as the native Detrima projects, research which is emerging directly out of our home data sets, out of the census, out of our own work that we've done. Then the third stage is where you come prepared with a dedicated research question that you're going to use the HGIS platform to answer. And we've begun this stage in Decima now where we've begun inviting collaborators with data sets of their own from similar times, from Florence in the 16th, 17th centuries, to map their data sets against the census and to ask data-driven questions of their own research. And I'm going to show you a couple of those projects which have really taken Decima's capabilities beyond simple socioeconomic analysis of a census. So Decima emerges from a couple of backgrounds. There's a historical background, which I'm going to talk about first, and then there is a project background. There's a reason why we're doing this entire thing. In the early 16th century, and really in the late 15th, the oligarchic city-states of early modern Italy, which some of you may be familiar with, but broadly based in the Renaissance, northern Italy is a collection of semi-independent oligarchic city-states. By the 16th century, and certainly throughout the 16th century, most of these semi-republican political bodies fall under the control of one house who becomes a duke or becomes a prince or becomes a marchese. And in Florence, this is the House of Medici, who everyone must have heard of the House of Medici. And they establish, they transfer from republican oligarchs to absolutist dukes in the 1530s. The duke who interests us the most is Duke Cosimo I de' Medici. He is the sort of rural scion of this family. He's a bit of a strange guy, and I'll get into a little bit about why that is. But accompanying this political process, whereby the Italian states fall under the sway of absolutist monarchs, for want of a more nuanced term, there are two processes that go along with this, which are possibly caused by, certainly one of them is caused by, and then the second is at least correlative with. First is an absolute explosion of documentation in the 16th century. Italy is already known for its rich archival sources, for the comprehensiveness and the fulsomeness of its archive, dating well back to 12th, 11th, 13th centuries. But really in the 16th century, you start seeing, with more paper comes more records of all sorts of kinds. You start seeing more documentation produced by ordinary people, more petitions. More diaries, more home accounting, but broadly across society you see just an explosion of writing, archiving, documentation, record keeping. This, like I said, this is part of this process of centralization of governments. A centralized government requires centralized administration, and so tax censuses become a very important form of governance by these new, by these absolutist regimes. So the tax census, where you determine the wealth of your city, is also a means by which you govern that city and in which you lay your claim to it. So you see attempts across northern Italy by early absolutist governments to collect this information, to sort of create a picture of their population. You see early attempts in Milan and you see early attempts in Bologna. But most census work in the earlier phase of this is still being done by the church. It's done at the parish level. The term is status dei animi, the state of souls survey that a parish would do. But in the sort of mid-16th century, we start seeing secular governments producing censuses for their own purposes, often fiscal. So in 1551, our man Cosimo I orders what will be the first tax census of his rule. He wants a survey of the value of owned properties in the city of Florence. So he sends a team of notaries knocking door to door, and they say, who owns this house? And so says, I do. And then the scribes, based on its neighborhood, based on the income of the owner, based on what they paid for it, assess the building in the same way that our houses are assessed annually for taxes now. So this is the first one that he does in 1551, and it's pretty bare bones. He looks at ownership. Then in 1561, he orders a second survey, and this one is much more comprehensive. This one, he looks not only at home ownership to get taxable wealth, but also at all of the residents, all of the renters, all the leaseholders, all those who are living free of charge. And he also counts up bodies within these houses, right? So for a given entry in the 1561 census, we have a much more full picture of who is in that building at any given time and how much they pay in rent and what they do for a living and who their wife is, for instance. What comes next? So this development of documentation and this explosion of record keeping that we see in the early 16th century is really sort of one of the two pillars that the Detriment Project is built on, because without this kind of document, without this really full exploration of a city's demographics, we wouldn't be able to access this kind of picture of the city. The second development is a rapid development of cartography and map making and spatial knowledge in the 16th century. Medieval maps they don't look like that. Medieval maps are typically symbolic. They are not meant to refer to physical spaces, but rather they're meant to orient the viewer towards his position vis-a-vis heaven and Jerusalem. So we frequently refer to the early medieval maps as a T-map, and they're usually just the Mediterranean with Jerusalem on the top, and then the Mediterranean stretching westward down the page, if that makes sense. And they're unrecognizable from what we would consider to be geography. In the 15th century, as the age of exploration gets underway, people need to use maps to do things instead of just to look at and orient yourself towards God. So you have the development of maps which are known as portolani, Portoland maps, and they are essentially maps of the coast of Africa. And they get better and better as people sail further and further down Africa, and so Vasco da Gama is using Portolani to round the Cape of Good Hope, for instance. Following the Portolani and sort of the development of cartography as a tool and as a skill, you start seeing a kind of academic and political interest in city and state maps. On the academic side, we have Georg Braun and Franz Hogenberg, who in 1572 published the result of a long project. It's called the Civitatis Orbis Terrarum, the cities of the world. And what it is absolutely beautiful aerial, full color city maps of most European cities, certainly all of the modern capitals and a significant number of cities that most of us wouldn't even recognize to see in a map anyway. You can tell that they pay attention, that these are already high quality maps. They pay attention to proportionality of geography. They pay attention to north-south orientation, although the north-south orientation is often different than what we would use. But they are designed to be representationally accurate pictures of the city, so that when you're looking at this, you know that you're looking at Brussels, for instance, right? This is a pictorially correct depiction of the city. And in order to create these maps, they develop techniques of surveying, the modern cartography techniques that we are sort of most basically familiar with are developed in the early 16th century and throughout the 16th century as a means to improve the quality of maps. So this is an academic project from Braun and Hogenberg. They travel the continent drawing these maps. It's quite a long process, but you also have much more political maps, where these new absolutist governments are very much interested in presenting their city as a powerful place. Venice is not an absolutist state. It remains a republican oligarchic character, although you could argue that that oligarchy is itself an absolute ruling class. But you can tell from this map of Venice, which is from around 1500, that this is designed to show the glory of the city, right? You have the god Neptune swimming at the mouth of the Grand Canal. You have the you can see the arsenal, which is producing the strength of the state. This map makes Venice look good. It's being blown by the four winds, and it's withstanding their gusts, right? This is a strong Venice that is unassailable from the outside, and that's what this map is meant to show, right? It's a political map that demonstrates the power of the city. I don't know why this isn't working. There we go. And this is the map that we use. As you can see, it's a highly detailed overhead view. This is the city of Florence. It's done by a monk named Stefano Buonsignori, originally commissioned in 1584, and it's commissioned by the Duke of Florence, who at the time is Ferdinando I de' Medici. He's the son of Cosimo I de' Medici, and he commissions this as a view of his city, right, of his ducal capital. This is the presentation of his power by this monk named Stefano Buonsignori. We don't know much else about the cartographer himself. He's an Olivetan monk, and he also did a map of the entire duchy at one point, but beyond that, we really don't know anything about him. The Buonsignori map is a political project. There are buildings which are outsized in it, so up in the middle, my laser doesn't work. Up in here, you can see the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall, which occupies the center frame of the map and is really the focal point. And your eye is also drawn to the cathedral, as well as to the main civic spaces, right? The main locuses of political power in the city. It's designed to make an impact on the viewer, right? It also shows the city existing kind of in its own space. It's unrealistic that all of these immediately outside the walls are immediate gardens and fields, right? There are suburbs to this town. I mean, there are houses stretching away from the walls, lean-tos piled up against them. This shows an unrealistically clean Florence, is what I'm trying to say, right? This is a presentation of a beautiful city to its duke. There were attempts to color it in the 17th century, which would have made it look even better, and you can now actually go online and you can buy colored reproductions of it for $700. I haven't. But it, the coloring attempts, just it damaged some of the paper, and then they removed the coloring, and that damaged it even worse. There's a copy done in 1695, a new printing, and this is the one that we use. And the 1695 one updates some of the political process that has taken place between 1584 and 1695. So the map is actually updated. The middle of the bridges is known as the Ponte Vecchio, the famous bridge of Florence. In the original map, the Ponte Vecchio, as of 1584, was still used by the butchers. It was still the butchers' area because they could just toss refuse from their slaughterhouses into the river. However, sometime between 1584 and 1695, the Duke and his wife moved from the Palazzo Vecchio down to the Palazzo Pitti here, and so they have to cross the Butcher's Bridge to get from home to work. At this point, the Duke decrees that it is no longer the Butcher's Bridge, but it's the Jeweler's Bridge. And so that's why now when you go to Florence, the Ponte Vecchio is all gold shops, it's all goldsmiths, right? So that is updated in the 1695 printing, as well as they add the Duchess's corridor, which she had built so that she could go from home to work without going outside. One of the reasons that we picked this map for our project is that it's pretty accurate. He surveyed it from 5 hills surrounding the city. You can actually see him sitting here with his little surveying kit, his little sextant, and I don't quite understand cartography, but by determining the proper angles of all these street intersections, he's able to recreate mathematically the picture of the city that you see here. It's pretty accurate. There are some slight skews in it. For instance, it's not oriented north-south, it's slightly turned that way. And the riverbed is slightly too large at the eastern end of the city. But generally it's a pretty accurate map spatially. So that's why we ended up choosing this map, because it fits very well into a modern cartography. It also reflects the sort of impetus behind the census itself, right? They are both part of the same project, which is the sort of establishment, proclamation, and celebration of Medici rule over Florence as it consolidates over the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's the historical background, is this explosion of documentation and then cartography. Our project interest grew actually out of a research project into sex work and prostitution in early modern Florence. My supervisor has been working on this for a long time, and one of the problems that he was never able to resolve was, what are the spatial impetus behind the regulation of sex work? Much of the legislation and laws regarding prostitution in Renaissance Florence have a distinctly spatial element. Prostitutes must practice here. Prostitutes may not practice there. But it's always related to a place. They must be outside the walls. They must be 200 feet from a convent. These are always spatially loaded regulations, right? And so we needed to find a way to make sense of these spatial regulations. Typically, historians tend to interpret these things as ritually significant. You know, if you're not allowed to be within 200 feet of a convent practicing the sex trade, it's because the convent is a sacred space and the presence of prostitution is a pollutant in that area. So that's sort of the old Mary Douglas purity and danger anthropological view of it. We thought there might be something a little more practical here. Sex work within 200 yards of a convent might be noisy, right? Prostitutes are known for being rowdy and aggressive, for getting in street fights in early modern Florence. They are frequently hauled up by the police for mischief, right? So we wondered if there's something really quite simple and in fact basic going on in these regulations, which is that nuns didn't want to have to listen to prostitutes or see them, right? Or smell the butchers, right? Stuff like this. Like, is there something more sensual about regulation of life in the early modern city? And so our interest in cartography actually kind of developed from an interest in sense. And that's why sense appears in the title of the book, because our ultimate goal is to be able to map sounds and smells. And then we can talk more about that later, but it's exciting stuff. We realized that in order to answer the question of what did the spatial regulation of sex work in Renaissance Florence mean and what was it based upon, we actually needed a significant database of base level information that we could compare prostitutes' lives against. We knew about the 1561 census. We knew that it was out there, but we hadn't really gone through it before, and we knew about the Buonsignori map, both of which have been used before by a guy named Robert Litchfield in a book called Florence Ducal Capital, and he presented a fairly static picture of the city by dividing this map. He divided into 84 squares on a grid, sort of equal-sized squares on a grid, and then you go to his website and you click on a square, and it says, ooh, in this neighborhood there are lots of shoemakers, and it's a pretty poor neighborhood, and there's not many nobles. So it gives you sort of basic neighborhood level information, but we wanted to get a little further down. We wanted to get down to the level of the individual building and the individual house, which we knew we could do using this census. So, there we go, I think, yes. First thing we had to do was get the census. So we ordered it on CDs from the Archivio di Stato di Florence. I think they charged us €1 per photograph. Extraordinarily expensive, but worth the cost. And this is an example of an entry from that census. So our first task was to take this and transform it into something which was legible to a computer, which was in a database, and which could be made spatialized, which could be made GIS compatible. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit, and I'll do a bit of a translation as I go. Oops. So this is from San Giovanni Quarter, which is the largest, most populous quarter in Florence, and this is pretty close to the end of the census. So this is when it's at its most complete and most comprehensive in terms terms of the information you're going to get. So the scribes have walked up and they've knocked on some guy's door, and someone answers and they ask questions, and here's the information that they come out with. So this is the house of Domenico di Lorenzo, who was a battilano, which means a wool beater. The wool industry in Florence is very, very important. Una casa sulla piazza di San Benedetto, a house on the square of St. Benedict. Popolo di San Benedetto, in the parish of St. Benedict. Contigua alla predetta et alla piazza della Pelotole, attached to the aforesaid and to the square of the large balls. With a workshop beneath, con bottega sotto, già a uso di scarpellino, used to be a stocking maker's, et oggi è uso di casa, and now it is used as a house. Abita lui e Giovanni di Bartolomeo. Domenico lives there, as does Giovanni di Bartolomeo, who is a donzello. He's it's like a sidekick. All'arte della lana. He's a garzone, a general task monkey, a gopher. Right? He's a gopher at the Arte della Lana, the wool guild. So this wool beater rents a room to a boy from the guild that he works in, della Lana. He rents it to him for 4 lire, and sta l'abitazione, the house itself is assessed at 37 lire. And what's it say on the bottom? And also there is Tozzo di Sant'Andrea di something, who's a tessitore. There's one other person who lives there. It gets a little hard to read at the bottom sometimes. How on earth do you take that and put it on a map, right? That's a lot of information all in one census. Whoa. Okay. This is our FileMaker database. So you can see that we've broken down that entry there into multiple fields, right? And we've tried to break it down as discreetly as possible. This is actually an early version of the database, and you can see that in occupation, the field on the bottom right, I have the occupation of both the owner and of the tenant. And you can see that, where am I going also? No, that's the one to show on this one. The occupation has the information for both. So for instance, I needed to break that down into 2 fields. So I have separate occupation fields now for each and every tenant of a household, up to 5 heads of household. Furthermore, you can see that we have his name is Domenico di Lorenzo Battilano, but in order to say, find out to compare family structures using last names only, we had to break apart the names. So it actually took about 3 or 4 different refinements of sort of building up and then breaking down the database into more and more discrete parts until such point as we have about 53 discrete fields of data for any given entry. One of the difficulties of early modern sources is that not all of the entries are identical or consistent, so there's probably not many entries where all 53 fields are used. In fact, I don't know that there's any, but there are 53 possible fields of data that can be drawn out of any given census entry here. Critical to the entire project is the second line here, right? Una casa sulla piazza di San Benedetto, in the neighborhood of San Benedetto, next to, right? They're very assiduous about describing where they are in the city. So they know which street they're on, they know when they're turning a corner, they know which direction they're turning that corner, they know when they are skipping sections and moving to new sections. So they're very good about letting the reader know their process as they go through. And this is what we needed. For instance, nowhere in here do you see a house number, do you? when geocoding properties, modernist historians have a huge leg up on early modernists, which is the numbered address system. Numbered address systems can be automated, and you can convince your computer program to draw the map for you if you can just feed it numbered addresses. There are no numbered addresses for 16th century Florence, unfortunately, but they were extremely good at noting corner properties. So I had to develop a method to geocode all of these individual properties, which I did by identifying the corner properties of any given street and creating GPS coordinates for them in the GPS or in the GIS program, and then in Excel actually just creating a regularized series in between those two corner properties that accounted for all the properties in between. This has its issues, of course. This is the end result. What you see, these are, every individual dot is one of our census entries and can be identified, can be explored, can be queried. But what you see is that these are all straight lines. It looks very regular. It looks extremely ordinary and sort of like a planned city. What you can't see at this zoom level is that all of the gardens are just full of sheds. They're full of lean-tos. There's a lot of people living in shacks in different, like in garden sheds behind people's houses. This is what I call a representational accuracy. It is true to the order of the information in the census. It is true to the idea that one neighbor is in between two other neighbors. They may not be exactly where they were in the 16th century on my map, but they're at least next to the right people, and on either side of them you know who is where relative to other people, and that's what we were trying to go for. So that's the sort of breakdown of the process by which we built the detriment. It involved this is the first step, right? This is the creation of the database and the geocoding of the references, of the records. That took, let's see, we started in 2010, and I finished this geocoding in, I want to say spring 2013, because I was working on it while I was doing my archival work. So it takes a long time. This is and it takes a lot of going back and forth, and it takes a lot of reconsidering how things will work and testing to see if they do work and being frustrated when they don't. But the end result is that we have a visualized database of 9,500 households in 1561 Florence, each of which can contain up to 53 fields of data on that household, on that building, which may contain up to 5 different households. It's quite robust. So now I'm going to take you through what I call the native projects, and this represents that stage 2 of the project, which is where we're experimenting with the native data set, with the home data, to see what kind of questions it could answer, to test its capabilities, and to try and attract more people to use it too. So this is the one that I've been mostly working on recently. This is very straightforward analysis of household values of a particular occupation. So these are tessitori. Jen's students from this morning will know well about the tessitori of Santa Maria Novella, which is this neighborhood. And so what I've done is I've coded their houses according to the assessed taxable value. So these are not the rents they pay, but these are the taxed values of the homes they live in, which gives you a sense of gives you a bit of a sense of the quality of their lodgings. That's the word. And then it also, so what you see is that the vast majority of weavers are living on the lower end of the economic scale, right? Some of them are paying 0 rent, which means they either own their hovel or they're living there on someone else's charity, but most of them pay well beneath 12 lire, which is about the average rent in Florence at the time. There are also extremely wealthy weavers, like these two fellows down here, who both own houses that are are taxed at 30 scudi per annum, which is a very expensive house. That's a downtown palazzo is what it is. What you see is that the poorest of them live along the riverbank. The riverbank in the 16th century was disgusting. Right now you can rent an apartment on that same street for €1,100 a night, but in the 16th century it was absolutely where the poorest of the poor lived. I wanted to do this project because, again, it goes back to Burr Litchfield's book, and he has a brief analysis of the weavers of Santa Maria Novella, and he sort of gives the impression that they're kind of a uniform group, and also that they all live further north than they do. But when I went into the census and mapped the individual properties, I see actually that there's a wide degree of stratification among the profession, and that they're actually pretty spread out across the quarter, but with a significant concentration closer to the river rather than in the middle of the quarter. That was shocking to me because it cut across what we understood about the weavers so far. And it also showed that within groups there is stratification, right? Every group has its own internal hierarchy, even if it's at the lowest of the social hierarchy generally. And weavers are among the most sort of marginalized of Florentines. Then I wanted to look at, how do those weavers survive? How do these poor folk make their way? So I looked at a few other professions in the same neighborhood. Butchers, bakers, and barbers. And when I say barber, I don't necessarily mean someone who just cuts your hair, but I mean also someone who sets a broken bone, who pulls a tooth. Barbers are a medical profession. They are the surgeons of the time, right? There's a difference between the physician and the the surgeons are barbers generally. So these are basic services, right? I have ovens, are the little red ovens. Butchers, that's normally a cleaver, and that's supposed to be a pair of scissors. But what you can see is that services are very equally distributed across the quarter, right? There's pretty much an oven on every corner, and where there isn't an oven, there's one around the corner. There are concentrations of barbers, but there's also pretty regularly spread out, and they would have worked at home too, right? They would have kept workshops in their homes. And then the butchers, who may have worked at home, but also are just as likely to be working over in the Mercato Vecchio area over here. They're also relatively equally spaced, so it's kind of fascinating. I did the measurements. You never have to walk anywhere in Florence more than 150 meters to get bread, which is just an example of sort of not planned, but regularly developed cities, right? They sort of organically, the ovens have all moved to regularly accessible places. And you can see there's a concentration downtown where population is higher and housing density is higher, but broadly they are equally accessible. Pretty much all three of these professions are sort of equally spaced across the quarter and indeed the entire city. What is wrong with this thing? So then we started figuring out, well, we ran some more experiments like that, different kinds of property values, different kinds of occupational analyses that we could do. And then we said, well, okay, we like the way this platform is running now. Let's open it up to some dedicated research ideas. And so we went back to that initial question about the regulation of prostitution. And here things start to get a little complicated, because here we're drawing in multiple data sets to really show how GIS can bring in different levels of analysis into a single frame. So what we have here on this map, the bells represent convents and monasteries. Black bells are nuns, clear bells are monks. Black streets represent streets where prostitution is permitted, and white streets represent where it's banned. The circles around the monasteries are a 200-foot buffer zone to represent that 200-foot space represented in the 1548 legislation. So what you see is actually that there's a really tight line being drawn here, right? So for instance, in the eastern zone of prostitution allowed streets, there's convents on every corner of it. Nuns on every corner of it, right? So it's sort of bizarre that it's allowed on those streets within that boundary. Same with out on the Palazzolo. And then this area here is the old brothel district. It continues to be a brothel district despite attempts to eliminate it throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. So this is sort of the prescription of the sex trade, right? This is where you're allowed to do it. There are limited streets across the city, and you're supposed to only be practicing there. But where do they live? As you can see, these are prostitutes who are registered in the city's Ufficio delle Bollette, or I think it's the Onesta who does it. Yeah, it's the Onesta in Florence, Bollette in Bologna. So there is a magistracy whose job it is to register and track prostitutes and make sure that they are abiding by the regulations. And so these are the ones who have registered, and they have to say where they live. And what you can see is that the prostitutes who actually bother to register are generally pretty honest about sticking to the rules, and that they live generally close to the areas where prostitution is allowed, as you can see on there, right? There's broad concentrations of registered prostitutes in those areas. But when you turn to the Decima and you look at the census itself, they start to spread out a little more. And you start seeing them kind of living actually all over the city. And what you also see is that there are prostitutes and there are courtesans, right? There again, you have large degrees of economic and social stratification within this already marginalized group. So you have the woman who owns this brothel down here. There's about 18 women who live in it. And it's operated by a madam, and she has got to be one of the wealthier women in Florence. And then you also see that they live kind of wherever they want, mostly around the zones where they're supposed to be, but also in concentrations along the Via della Scala, along the Borgo Ognissanti. They're sort of widely dispersed. And they also move around those sacred spaces too, right? They skirt the regulations by living 202 feet away from the convent, sort of thing. Here I've mapped the value of meretrici homes, prostitutes' homes, against the average property values for their neighborhoods. So what you can see is that they tend to actually sit within or even a little above their average economic, their average neighbor in terms of wealth. So they're not the poorest of the poor necessarily. In fact, some of them are quite well off. But again, within that group, there are quite wealthy prostitutes and there are quite poor prostitutes as well. So after all of this sort of 3-year runaround, we finally got to answer, or start answering the question about what do the regulations around prostitution actually mean. And that was pretty exciting. The other one that I get really excited about is the 1630 plague. We have, from a colleague at University of London named John Henderson, he has records from 1630 of cases of plague in the neighborhood of San Lorenzo across Florence. And he wanted to investigate whether there was a relationship between the lived environment, the built environment of someone's neighborhood, and the impact of plague on that neighborhood. So what he's done is these are cases of plague per street in 12 months, 1630 through 1631. What you can see is that the majority of cases of plague tend to happen on the streets that are further out towards the walls, that come in from the gates, and that also what you can't see on this map, they are the poorer streets. These are the streets where living conditions are worse, where houses are packed tighter together, where there's more people in any given house, and that his hypothesis ended up being correct, which is that plague hits poor and dirty neighborhoods harder than it hits wealthy, well-maintained ones. It seems kind of obvious, but it's nice to show it at least anyway. This project also allowed me to introduce time into the map and to start mapping change over time. And this is sort of where the real gold is that we want to be able to show how things change in space over time. So we can, this isn't a great video, but it shows, green is good, dark is bad. It shows the impact of the plague month by month on each street and then the totals at the end. So it shows that there's a real spatial and also temporal motion to plague, right? It disappeared for 2 or 3 months at a time there, and then it flares back up in particular places, and once it hits one street, it'll move to the street next to that, and you can see these patterns begin to emerge. with that, I'm going to end my spiel. So there's a few minutes of questions at least, and just leave you with the idea that this is a long-term project which continues to grow, and that is what the value of historical GIS brings to us, is that we can build tools that continue to work rather than a single project or a single product which we then abandon after publication. The idea is to keep it going, to expand it, to bring more people in, and to take it beyond Florence and the 16th century eventually. Okay, thank you very much. And we have some time for questions, right? Yes.
When alright, sorry, I was still pulling. When you were talking about like you were doing your own research and all that, and then you had your buddy come in and want to talk about research the plague and all that. Did you do those simultaneously, or did you just kind of like put yours to the back burner and focus on his, or how did you?
It's sort of, well, because by that point we had the database and the map pretty well established, right? Sort of the base layers of it. So the census was all mapped, and the street map was built, and that's what was really critical in the plague project, was actually it perfected my street map, which was nice. But it wasn't really a matter of putting one aside. It was sort of taking it on as it came. I will admit that often my writing gets put aside to make maps for other people. Gotta stop that. But it's part of the way that I've approached this project, is that I'm facilitating other people's research as well as doing my own, and so it's not time that I resent because, you know, my name's on the book. So yes.
So when you were doing like the whole census research and stuff, was there a way to see what was left out? To see, for example, there were resistance by business owners who didn't want to be counted and who didn't want to be assessed like everybody else was being assessed, so they have to pay more tax to run. Because I know through history, the census has always been this contested thing where people don't want to be certain people don't want to be controlled by the authorities, and one way to do that is not be measured and not be counted.
Yeah, this is a deeply insidious project at its core, right? The census of Cosimo I is a power grab, and people were wary of it, and right to be so. And so you have some places where no one answers the door, and they just kind of move on. More specifically excluded from the census are Jews, because they're paying a different tax, and then transient workers who may or may not have somewhere to live at the time. So there are people who are excluded by their already marginalized status in the city, Jews, homeless workers, etc. And there are also people who exclude themselves from it. I take it as given that many of the assessed values are lies, that many people are fudging numbers in order to reduce their tax load. This is something that we understand happens throughout history. So that's not, don't take these property values as the God-given truth, right? And certainly there are people who try and avoid it. There are people who tried not to answer the door, but the scribes came back if they could. So there's evidence in the manuscript. Sometimes they've gone back and modified an entry because they say like someone came in and told us more, or yeah. So it's a very organic process.
Were there penalties to not getting mapped?
Yeah, you don't participate, and there are penalties. And so what happened in the earlier censuses was, in 1427, rather than going door to door, the government called on people to come into the town hall and write down all your assets, declare your assets to us in person, rather than we're going to go to you. So people come in and say, oh, I've got this tiny little shack, and there's nothing in it. I have half a bed and one set of sheets, when they might in fact be living in a downtown palazzo with 12 rooms or something, right? So the 1561 and the 16th century census, generally one of the innovations is going door to door to try and avoid that kind of cheating, but there's always creative ways to cheat the tax man. Yeah.
So can I ask, was there any effort to perhaps have a separate
reckoning for the Jewish community. Now, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
this is
The Ventezima.
years before
Yeah.
the ghetto is
Yeah.
formed. So,
What you would expect to see around the time that they're doing a new decima would be the formation of a new Jewish Ventezima, a 20th tax. You don't see that. Which is kind of weird. Or at least if they do see it, I haven't found it. I don't spend that much time in the Florentine archives, as you know. So in terms of coming to a reckoning with the Jewish population alongside this census, I don't think it was that high of a priority at the time. I think at the time, Cosmo was pretty liberal with his Jews.
well, he was still attracting them, at least
Yeah.
through the,
And so putting a new heavy tax on them wouldn't be,
interesting.
yeah, it would be kind of counterproductive to his aims at the time. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you have this, so you mentioned that, that street along the river has turned from a poor to a very nice area. Do you have, for more mundane parts of the city, do you have an idea of how the legacies have played out over time? Have a lot of neighborhoods changed face or remain sort of in the same property value class?
Yeah, so one of the most interesting things is that there's a lot of empty space in this city, right? I mean, you can see that, these are all gardens, that's now the train station, gardens and orchards and intramural agriculture, right? Agriculture within the walls. And this is probably the biggest change that's happened to Florence, is that it's filled up its walls. It's now an entirely urban area within the walls, right? In terms of the economic profile of the neighborhoods, how they've changed, I'm afraid I can't speak to that too much. I don't know the modern city all that well. But I do know that at least the southern bank of the river, the Santo Spirito neighborhood, was and remains to this day sort of the traditional working class neighborhood of Florence, whereas the patricians and the businessmen tend to be on the north side, where the larger palazzi are. But that's sort of the most basic division I can give you, is north of the river is wealthier than south generally. Sir in the back.
Yeah, two questions. Do you have any plans to do additional years or different cities? And second question is, did you learn anything along the way to help go more quickly with database development, especially the geocoding, and
Yeah.
to help automate that? So
Absolutely. So number one is that we're currently transcribing the 1551 to see if it will compare in a meaningful way to the 1561. So that's the next step of this. And then beyond that, we will be moving out of Florence as well. So I want to do a map of Bologna soon, because that's my primary research city. But then as the project develops, I'm hoping that we can keep it going for a long, long time and move it around. Basically, have it be a digital atlas of early modern Europe, a social atlas of early modern Europe would be really interesting. I learned lots along the way. I learned which mistakes not to make in a database. Yeah, I learned how to organize it, right? And I think I'm going to stick with the same method if it still works for geocoding, because it was as close to automatic as it got, actually. And with the tables from the first census already done, I should be able to fairly easily transfer those over into the new census as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happened in the 10 years. But we have this fear that because the 1551 only actually talks about property owners, we're not going to see much change at all. Because if you look at renters and leaseholders, you would see people moving around all the time. But we're a little worried that home ownership might be more static than that. But we'll have to see. We don't know yet. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So on the, so your data's from 1561, you have a project that's looking at 1630.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with the 70?
With that gap?
How far?
Well, yeah,
go.
I am, because that 70-year gap doesn't rely upon the 1560 data. That 1630 mapping is just plague data. It's not actually drawing on the 1560
Characterization of
census.
the neighborhoods is relying. Well, I guess there's other sources for that.
No, it's drawn on the 1630 as well. Yeah. So I mean, and yes, San Lorenzo remained poor from 1560 to 1630 anyway. Like, this is a slow-moving city if it moves at all. One of the interesting things, and this is a particular period when there's not a lot of urban development going on, or much in terms of industrial development. And in fact, even in the early 17th century, you'd expect to see things kind of getting worse, because there's a general Italian decline in industry, particularly in Florence. The wool industry really falls apart in the 17th century. century. So I would actually expect to see things getting.
Is there census data? What's the next available?
There's 1632, so that comes next. But that's also, I mean, that's a post-plague census. That's who's left. That's getting an accounting of who's left and who died. So it's has its own idiosyncrasies. But again, and this is part of the difficulty of the early modern sources is you have to. They're not obviously comparable a lot of the time, and you have to find the ways that they speak to each other. You have to find the common points, and you have to accept that sometimes they're not going to speak to each other, that they're coming from different contexts, that they're dealing with different things, that they're inconsistent in their presentation of them. But broadly, I think that we're okay on the 1551 and the 1561, and I'll see what the 1632 looks like. I think it might be too far away and too impacted by the plague to make meaningful change over time comparisons. But there isn't a census in between, which is too bad. Because if there was some in the 1580s, that'd be great. But what can you do? Anything else, or can I let you guys go to your next? Well, I will say thank you very much for coming and indulging me.